Hello, welcome to another video on our channel. Here we translate testimonies of people who went through near-death experiences. Today we are going to know the story of Ilson. He says he was an atheist, and after a near-death experience full of surprises, he started to review his concepts about life. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Activate the notification bell to be notified of each new video. Now let's listen to Ilson's testimony. My name is Ilson Silveira. I graduated as an oceanographer. I am a professor at the University of São Paulo in the area of physical oceanography, that is, I work with mathematical modeling of deep currents, and I also make observations at sea, on board USP ships. In 2012, during one of my academic trips, I went to Portugal at the request of my director to give a lecture, actually 2 lectures, one at the University of Lisbon and another at the University of Algarve, in the city of Faro, in the south of Portugal. Then I went to rent a car to go to Faro, because, after all, we would have to travel on the 1st of May. It was April 30th, more specifically it was April 30th, 2012. I asked a student of mine to accompany me. He was a student at the time of his doctorate, and we went, the 2 of us, me and Leandro, this student, to rent the car. I asked Leandro to drive. I really prefer someone else to drive. I don't like to drive, I never have. So, we were on our way, and when we were close to the hotel, remembering, it was 2012, at that time GPS was a luxury, smartphones were not accessible yet, so we needed maps, because that's how we did it. I had the map open, and, when we finally got close, I was Leandro's co-pilot, next to him, in the front seat, in the famous passenger seat, and Leandro was driving the car, which was a small Clio. Fortunately, the European Clio, unlike the Brazilian Clio, had a series of reinforced iron bars on the door. I came to know that this saved my life. Then we arrived at a large avenue, and saw our hotel on the other side of the avenue. That is, we arrived at the hotel's avenue. It was a very wide avenue, with a flower bed in the middle, and there was a passage between one flower bed and another. Leandro simply said, "I'll go through this passage." We thought we could do that, since there was no sign. We didn't know there was a traffic rule. According to her, the only situation we could pass between those flower beds, which divide the 2 directions, is if we were a mail car or a police car. So we couldn't, or an ambulance, we couldn't do that. Leandro couldn't do it, but we did. And then, by force of fate, a car, a BMW, ran the traffic light, and there was an accident that pushed the Clio towards a pole. I remember when I woke up, the front of the BMW was practically in my lap. So, it was a minimally interesting experience, I would say, and I got really hurt. The last thing I remember awake, before the accident, was me, with the maps open, so I couldn't see anything. The map was big, it was the famous map, those famous travel maps from the rental companies, but I didn't see anything. I didn't see it, I just moved the map a little farther to see Leandro's image. That's my last memory, that is, the blow was so strong that I don't remember anything. I don't remember the accident, but I do know that at a certain point, I don't know how much time passed, I found myself awake, wide awake, in a very dark place. It was all very dark. Very, very dark. However, I could see that there were people there. There was more than one person, and at one point one of those people started talking to me. He or she was very close, because I heard the voice very close to me. And she or he said, "Son, you had everything in your life that you wanted. You were blessed, you had everything you wanted so far, you fulfilled your dream of profession, you married the woman you wanted. You traveled the world, you got your dream job, and you keep that dream job to this day. But, your journey isn't over, you can't stay here yet. You still need to pass some tests. Honestly, I didn't understand what these tests were. What I remember is that he said that. But don't worry, this return will happen in such a way that you won't have a sequel. You won't have sequelae, you'll walk normally, you won't have any bone marrow problems. And I kind of didn't understand, because I thought this thing was so specific. I wasn't feeling anything, quite the contrary. What I felt was a very pleasant feeling, as if I was being cherished all the time. I didn't see myself being projected through a tunnel, nothing like that. Only when I woke up I was in this dark place, and it seemed that there was a light that was very far away, because sometimes I saw some shadows, as if there were people passing by. And another thing that I also noticed, is that the person's voice was very familiar. I had lost my father exactly 3 years ago at that time, and I was still very shaken by this loss, and I wondered if it could possibly be him. Because I am from Rio de Janeiro, even though I have lived in Sao Paulo for many years, 25 years ago, but obviously I recognize my friend's countrymen when they talk to me, and that tone of voice was very similar. So I wanted to believe it was my father, but maybe it was my grandfather, his father, whom I barely knew. When he passed away, I was 4 years old. And the thing is, after that, I felt like he was always with me. And it was like I turned my back to go back. Okay, so what happened is I woke up. Oh, I forgot to say something, sorry. At one point, when he told me about the bone marrow, he asked me to tap my foot 3 times to see if there was a problem, that is, if I hadn't lost any nerve connections with my legs. And I tapped the ground 3 times with my right foot, which was exactly the foot that was near the front of the car, because only the Clio's door plate separated me from the BMW. Very good. So guys, what I remember is that at that moment Leandro, with a very emotional voice, that student who was next to me, started kissing my hand. You know, most of my students who receive my guidance affectionately call me uncle, and he kissed my hand and said, "Uncle, thank God you're alive, uncle, you're alive, uncle, you're alive." Actually, I don't know if he said thank God, I remember, because I think Leandro is an atheist. That is, but anyway, he said, "Uncle, you're alive, you're alive." I woke up a little groggy, and looked at him and said, "I am." "Well, it wasn't for me to be." Then he said, "Uncle, the accident was very ugly, we got screwed." I said, "What accident?" And then I passed out again. This time I don't remember anything. The only difference is, I woke up and they were sawing off the roof of the Clio and they pulled me. And they pulled me. But before I pull me, they put that collar on me, and then they pulled me in. I was put on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance. Apparently Leandro didn't suffer anything. Later we found out that he had a problem with his kneecap. He fractured his patella, poor thing. He helped me all the time to solve bureaucratic problems while I was in the hospital. And then what happened is that, when I got there in the ambulance, the impression I had was that someone was carrying me. I didn't feel a bit of pain. I had torn my head, because the neck support had twisted and I had ripped my head open and it was soaked with blood. It was a superficial wound, but I still have her mark here, right on my bald head. So, I remember that, after waking up, I was holding Leandro's hand as we went to the hospital. I remember a paramedic with that very strong Portuguese accent. She said to another paramedic colleague, "Look, it's the first time I've seen such a serious side collision accident and the person gets out of the car moving their legs. Usually there's a problem in the spinal cord." I thought it was curious, because I had already commented before. It sounded familiar somehow, even though it wasn't exactly the same sentence. Okay, I got to the hospital. I was given local anesthesia. They asked me if I was in pain. I said, "None." They asked if I needed medicine for pain. I said, "No." They took me in for a CT scan, said I had a concussion of the brain, and they used an expression that I really can't tell you. I don't remember what it was, but they told me. It was like, you know, when you just splash liquid on a mirror, a glass, something like that. They told me that the image of my brain, which the CT scan revealed, looked like I had a lot of small strokes. Forgive me, I don't know the terms well. He then said, "Look, you're going to a semi-ICU." They sewed my head, I felt no pain. The doctor called my attention saying that I would probably feel pain, because they didn't know if the anesthesia would work. But no, I didn't feel anything. I felt good. My biggest concern was talking to my family. I took a cell phone from a student who was doing the Science Without Borders program, and who was part of our group. She was there, so she was a guardian angel for me, and then we got back together. But I had that feeling the whole time. In fact, what impressed me the most was that feeling. It was a feeling of love, a feeling of peace. It was a feeling as if I was with someone the whole time and someone was caressing me, or someone was reassuring. I went to the semi-ICU. I stayed there for 2 or 3 days. I believe it was in the hospital. It was a simple public hospital, very simple, but I was impressed by how well everything worked. Everything was very clean. I noticed that the furniture was old furniture and the hospital was right in the center, close to the historic center of Lisbon. In fact, I think it was São José, the name of the hospital. I was treated very well there. So, I remember, I was a scared guy, and what happened was that there were people suffering a lot beside me, and one of them, who was also in a semi-ICU, there were boxes that were separated by curtains, but often these curtains were drawn. Those days were warm, it was spring, and, well, what happened was, one of the patients died. I reassured myself. A guy got desperate by my side. I tried to reassure him. I can't imagine myself, even today, acting that way. But I acted, and the impression I had all the time was that someone was protecting me, that someone was always caressing me. It was a feeling, I would say. It was like you had taken a super tranquilizer, and there was someone by your side hugging you, something like that. That really impressed me much more. That wonderful feeling impressed me much more than the memory itself and the words in the dark place. All this remained in limbo between what would be a dream and what would not, although it had an unusual clarity in my dreams. There were many problems. The travel insurance did not want to pay for my hospitalization. My wife decided to come from Brazil alone to meet me. We had to call the embassy. They were spectacular. They put pressure on the insurance. The insurance people then said that they would not pay for the hospital. I forgot to mention that at some point it was found that I had a hip fracture, and the fracture was, according to the first MRIs, my hip was misaligned. After 5 days, when I got out of the hospital, they told me I didn't need surgery because the hip was straight. They told me this is also very unusual. I have no idea. I went to the exact same hotel I had stayed at before, the one I was close to when I had the accident. And my students, I mean Leandro, my doctoral student who was accompanying me on the trip, and Juliana, that girl from Ciências Sem Fronteiras, who were there, showered me with perks and caresses, but always accompanied by someone else. I had no pain. I even have the medical record with me showing that I never had pain. The doctors said it was absolutely impossible for me not to feel pain. I just remember taking painkillers when I was in the semi-ICU. I had, I believe, 3 CT scans, and then I went to the regular ward after I was told that this splattering, which I think was the term they used, had been absorbed 3 or 4 days later. And that was it. My wife arrived about the 6th or 7th day. She managed to arrive, and that was another very interesting thing. The moment Leandro opened the hotel room door, and my wife, with tears in her eyes, came towards me, almost running, the impression I had was that something came out of me. I made a move and left. And then, obviously, from then on, I only felt the love of my wife. The period I was unconscious during the accident was not that short. I know that, according to Leandro, we stayed in the car for about 40 minutes until they took us out. I had no idea, but Leandro said it seemed like an eternity for him. And he was crying because, he said, I killed one of the people I love most in my life. I don't know how much time I spent in that dark environment, but it was something. I don't remember being transported to that place, I just started noticing myself there at a certain point. That's one of the things, later I tell what happened to me in the future, about how I managed to interpret certain things. One thing that has to be clear is that, I was an atheist, totally an atheist. I am a scientist, that is, I had to look at the situation afterwards to try to understand what had happened to me. I tried to look at the situation from a scientific point of view. But, back to what I was saying. The first thing I did was study exactly what an NDE is. And what did I discover? I found that I didn't actually have, at least I don't remember, several of the so-called stages of a traditional NDE. So much so that I doubted it was an NDE. So what I remember was simply this. The person who talked to me spoke about the time like I told you before, maybe I forgot a sentence or two, sometimes I remember. I don't remember it having a smell, color, I just remember that, there were several people in that place and I don't remember exactly, it wasn't that long ago, because that was exactly the time that the person's speech lasted, the one I reproduced here more or less. Another thing that happened is that the experience ended when he asked me to tap the floor of the car 3 times so that I could see that I had movement in my legs. At least that's what I understood. In fact, he said exactly that. He said, stamp your foot 3 times so you can see that you haven't damaged the spinal cord. And then, yes, the moment I tapped my leg, my foot 3 times on the floor, Leandro realized that I was alive. And that's when I actually turned to the side, opened my eyes, and saw him crying and kissing my hand non-stop. You can ask me if it wasn't Leandro who told me to put my foot down, but I'm sure not, I even asked him. Another thing that calls attention is the following, the person or that being who was at his side, he used a medical expression, this is very unusual. He could have told me, you won't have anything in the column. Because any layperson would say, you didn't hurt your spine but. You didn't hurt your spinal cord, that's already an anatomical term, right? One interesting thing is that I have no medical relatives who could have mentioned this to me, past or present. My grandfather, who I suspect may have been that person, was a prosthodontist, but did not have a university degree. My father, he was an economist, administrator. It is interesting that, the impression I have, is that that state of acceptance that I had, which was so pleasant, became more intense afterwards. My interpretation was that, because I felt it, it was like a feeling that I was facing this person and suddenly he moved, the person changed direction, put his arm around my back and we moved on. That was the impression I got. Although I didn't feel anything physical, because it's weird, you know, I didn't feel anything physical. Another thing, I'm chatty. I had no opportunity to speak, I could not speak. Then I kept thinking about the story he told me that I needed to go back because of the exams I had to do. Look, honestly, I was living a magical moment in my life, which I can call my peak, my professional peak at one point. I had just become a full professor, reminding those who don't know the academic term, full professor is the former chair professor, and that was something generally expected, at USP, for a person much older than me. I had 49 at the time, so I didn't quite understand what the person meant by tests, because it was the reason I came back. But I thought it was weird. But I started to study the phenomenon, and that's when I came across something else that made me postpone thinking about what happened. I started reading and came across something that is simpler than an NDE, but some people relate it as part of an NDE, which is called the third factor of man. Third man factor is a phenomenon, and I've read a lot about it. I read a book about it. The name of the author of the book is John Geiger, if my memory serves me right. He says that just when the brain is dying, or when you feel like you are dying, even if the brain is working, you don't have the physical strength to do anything anymore, and so you develop a mechanism in which you feel a person by your side. That's why the term is the third man, because this was first observed in climbers of Mount Everest and later on an expedition to Antarctica, to the South Pole. These were the 2 times this was observed. And then what happened is that in this third man factor, these people simply, in addition to the companion, because as you know the climber never goes alone, they always go in pairs, so you would have a third person, who would be that person who would really accompany you, and that it was a presence that did not speak, but was present in thought. So much so that this was interpreted for a long time as being, in quotes, proof of the existence of the guardian angel, that is, that protective spirit. Science simply says that he managed to reproduce the effect of the third man, triggering an electrical part, I don't remember where. But they managed to reproduce this phenomenon in extreme cases. For us, who are from the era of carburetor cars, the effect of the third man would be, according to science, and this is reinforced in John Geiger's book, This Experience, also scientific. He would simply say it would be the famous jump start. Accelerator. It's your body's attempt to leverage, so it would basically restore that figure of a supernatural being to support you, help you, and make the process as painless as you try to survive. Okay. That was in 2012. I studied and finally thought, that's explained, that's what happened to me. I remained an atheist, well done, thank you. At the beginning of 2014 my life started to change. I started to have very serious problems, including legal ones. This hurt and affected me deeply. It threw me into a deep depression for 2 years, in which I was practically immobilized. I had to work hard every day to be able to go to university. I started to take a lot of medication. Until today I take prescription medication because of that, and my life has become increasingly difficult. Several of the achievements I had, many of respect, of renown, started to be taken away from me, started to be reversed, and that was something that hurt me deeply and dragged me down. That's when, one day, I remember that it was absolutely by chance, that I was talking to a friend, Paolo Alcarpi is his name, and he told me, Ilson, it makes sense, maybe you were warned about this, you received something premonitory. I shook my head and started thinking, and then again. There are times when I'm like, am I imagining this? Am I trying to justify this? But the fact is, I saw it. The impression I got was really one of regret. That is, because my life until then had been, as they used to say back then, in the 80s, teenager, easy, and that I was going to face some difficulty now. And I faced it. It's not over yet. And that's when I started the process. I'm starting, still full of doubts, full of confusion. I'm starting a process of spiritualization that has done me a lot of good. I continue to have many students being guided by me, at the 3 levels, undergraduate and graduate, master's, doctorate, now postdoctoral students. Anyway, I have an extremely productive laboratory, and I open new paths. I decided to do new things, I decided to try different things, and I started to be much less afraid of change than I was before. Because I am a scientist, I felt the need to find an explanation for what I witnessed. It was precisely the evidence of the being speaking to me that led me to try to pursue the question of the third man. And I found in the third man factor an explanation. At least science says there is an explanation for this, and I heard about it. It was only much later, when the most serious problems started to happen, that I actually started to understand. I started to awaken to spirituality. There was a greater development of feeling, of detachment. My wife and daughter are proof of that. In the case of my daughter, I remember talking to her as soon as I got home from Portugal, but I still had doubts about what I had experienced. I still ask myself today, so much so that I thought a lot before sending this report, but I decided to send it and said, I don't think I had an NDE, but anyway, if you find it interesting, I'm willing to make the testimony, if you think it's appropriate. But please read and decide. I've always been extremely skeptical and always been what I would call the devil's advocate. People say, look, your questions are mine too, I have something to tell you. And look, one thing that has to be clear, I suffered the accident on April 30th, 2012. These problems that happened to me would be the exams, the tests that I would have to pass. They began to stun me in December 2013. That is, more than a year has passed. And yet I started to ponder, I didn't connect the dots until 2016. It was a bit late, because I, in my head, said, it's the third man effect. I closed the book, found an explanation for myself, and put my head on to relax. And then, when it started to happen, my life turned inside out. That's when I was talking to Paolo, he said it could be a premonition. I then started attending a spiritist study group at some point, which are scientists, and which meet and discuss these types of phenomena on Tuesdays, at lunchtime, in an empty room at the USP Institute of Physics. In these meetings we discuss several things. I was always one of the most critical of the experiences, as everyone is, I think. There are people who are connected to plasma physics, there are 2 or 3 astronomers who work with this issue, there are people who work with heavy physics, there are biology colleagues, and now there is an oceanographer. But it took me a long time to get there. This experience awakened in me a great curiosity about death. Because it became very clear to me that there is a difference between mind and consciousness. I mean, between the brain and consciousness. The experience I went through had nothing to do with my brain. I didn't see my body like in many near-death experiences. I would have liked to have seen it, but it didn't happen. That's why I also doubted it was an NDE. I didn't develop any kind of skills either. What the experience changed in me is what I said. I started to have a very clear clarity. If you ask me if I've ever had such vivid dreams, I say yes. And today I even believe I have explanations for them, but that happened after that. But the sharpness was so great, and this I reported, wrote, and have been saying ever since. Since the event and long before the chance for me to accept that there is something else, which again, I believe there is something, I believe there is some order, but I have no idea what it is. And I even believe that this must be an experience inherent to people, or rather, to embodied beings, somehow. That is, material beings, because look, there are several cultures that actually do not relate this phenomenology to any religious aspect. For example, one of the first things I did when I was looking for the third man effect was to look up some videos on YouTube, and I came across some very interesting videos of mediums. But these were not religious mediums, they have their own history. There's a feature film that's 3 or 4 hours long. I had the patience to watch, well, I stayed in bed for 3 months. I think the name is Skull. It is the name of a city in the United Kingdom, and the mediums are gathered there precisely to discuss and then also film all the transcendental experiments, since materialization, and nobody is talking about religion, nobody is talking about God. Do I believe that God exists? Nowadays, honestly, I think it's very likely that God exists. There are people who take care of us. I really believe that, because I felt it in myself. For me, that was the beginning, middle, and end. The only thing to say is that I realized that this was real in some way, and when I realized that there were tests, I saw that this experience somehow had a purpose. To stop? Because it still took a long time for me to understand what was going on. Between the appearance of the problem and me looking for an explanation, and looking for a spirituality, 2 years passed. More than 2 years, 2.5 years. This experience, I think it complements life. I think it happened to guide me. I still don't do the right thing, okay? Because today I became a much more passionate person, much less meritocratic. Because you know that scientists end up moving towards meritocracy, and in an unequal country like ours, I discovered that I was absolutely a perfect idiot, being meritocratic, and then, these things happened, but I think I just needed to have an experience or see things in a different way than what I was used to seeing. To end this account, I would like to quote Shakespeare. But first, what I would like to talk about is the following. I had the happiness of living and working in some of the greatest academic temples of humanity, which are the two temples, side by side, located in Cambridge, in the United States, which are Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I studied part of my PhD and where I work, and I've been a visiting researcher a few times. What I say to you is this: we really don't know anything. Our laws, the vast majority of them, derive from empiricism. Obviously we are still doing a statistical description, so what I would say to you is that, in my opinion, there is much more between heaven and earth than vain human philosophy can understand. I fell from my pedestal of arrogance and started to have an open mind for certain things. It doesn't mean that I became a fetishist, that I became a person who believes in anything. But I believe so. There are many different things that we are discovering as our sensors, devices, etc. develop. How many times has this happened throughout our human history, right? And keep my mind open. If you ask me if I believe in God, I usually say yes, but not the anthropocentric God we create. We still don't have all the answers, and it would be very presumptuous to think that we know everything and that everything can be explained by the scientific knowledge generated by humanity so far. So what did you think of this amazing story? Leave your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's bring more people the hope that there is life beyond what the eyes can see.